Linux versus Windows and Mac for your desktop. Doesn't seem to matter what tutorial I do about Windows, there's always the people who comment in the forums about how Linux is the best desktop and I'm an idiot because I run Windows, or that I'm doing a Linux tutorial and instantly anything I've said is invalid because I run Windows on my desktop. So I thought I'd do a video that basically explains why you generally have to be an idiot in order to run Linux on your desktop, with some caveats. Linux is a great server platform. I run Linux for almost all of my servers, with the exception of stuff that runs on Google App Engine that kind of runs in its own little world of strange OS that I don't have to think about. But I run CentOS for most of my dedicated servers. But I would never consider running Linux on my desktop unless I was doing development all day, every day, and needed a dedicated development environment that was going to be Linux so that I could be writing and testing in the same place. That said, that's about the only reason that I would consider running Linux on a desktop. Linux lacks the commercial applications that Windows and Mac have, and many of the applications that are available that are analogs to those commercial applications aren't legal. And that's a big challenge if you're going to have Linux in an office environment or enterprise environment. If you're not going to be in an office or enterprise environment, then you're starting to look at, why am I running Linux at home? Because if it's not to do work, then it should be to play games, and Linux is lousy for playing games. So it really comes down to Linux doesn't have good video editing software. That's a big problem for any of us who are making YouTube videos. But it's also a problem if you ever just, on a one-off, decide that you want to do something. There's no legal software that's on Linux that's going to allow you to do H.264 encoding, because you have to pay a license in order to do that H.264 encoding, which is also the problem with a lot of the things that do PDF editing and JPEG editing and any of the manipulation of images that often require royalty payments to the patent holders of those technologies. Linux has gotten around a lot of this stuff by saying that the user is responsible for obtaining those licenses. But for the most part, how do you go about calling up SMPTE and saying, hey, I need a single H.264 license, how do I send you my $24? And while I have done that for certain things, and have done it in mass for certain organizations where I needed to deploy a product and wanted to make sure that we were licensed and legal, it's really difficult to do, and it creates a huge overhead from an administration standpoint. If you're an individual user and you're going to leave comments in the thread about, well, screw that, I'm not going to pay the royalties, Linux is free, information should be free, great, just, leave the rest of your contact information because you're a pirate, and somebody should show up on your doorstep and take your stuff. And that really is kind of my feeling on it, is that I love Linux, I love the open source products that come from Linux, but for the desktop applications, most of the desktop applications that I need for my day-to-day basis aren't going to be legal on Linux until somebody makes commercial versions of those products. And for the most part, because Linux doesn't have a large enough install base, you're never going to see Sony Vega for Linux, or Pinnacle for Linux, or even the Adobe Flash products for Linux. And as a result, Linux can never be the primary operating system for anybody who wants to do anything more than a little bit of word processing and coding. Some of you will say, oh, but there's all of these applications online, you can do all of that stuff in the cloud. Well, yes, but as soon as you're saying that I'm going to do all of my applications in the cloud, it doesn't really matter what operating system you're using, and you can't say, oh, Linux is better than Windows or Mac because I'm editing in the cloud, at which point you're saying iPad is as good as Linux or Windows or Mac, and that we should all just be running, Android or iOS as our primary operating system. And the minute the internet's down, and the internet was down here for the last couple of days because of snowpocalypse in Seattle, but you know, you're dead in the water, and you can't do that if you actually have to get anything done. And if you're not trying to get anything done, you're back to your device as a recreation device, and if your device is a recreation device, all that really matters is whether or not there is Steam for your operating system, because let's face it, all of the games are going to come from somewhere, and they aren't deployed on Linux. So, again, not everyone who runs Linux on their desktop is stupid. The people who are writing code all day, that makes a lot of sense. People who are doing certain types of test environments, it makes a lot of sense. But Linux is inferior just because of the lack of deployment means there aren't a whole lot of commercial applications, and in order to get anything done, you're going to have to buy some commercial applications because there just aren't legal alternatives to most of the software that we all use on a regular basis, even just for small stuff.